Good evening, everyone. To continue with our report, my part is on the purpose and scope of Leviticus. Leviticus tells how sinful people could approach a holy God and how they could live holy lives. To make atonement for their sins, the Lord prescribed a series of sacrifices culminating in the offerings presented by the high priest on the Day of Atonement. The covenant people were expected to avoid sexual immorality and to obey all of the Lord's commandments. If anyone ignored these laws and commandments, the penalties were severe. In chapter 26, the nation is warned that if they break God's covenant in the promised land, the result will be famine, disease, defeat, and eventually deportation. The first purpose and scope of Leviticus: holiness and the presence of God. When the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle at the end of Exodus in chapter 40, verse 34, the Israelites were very much aware of the presence of God. God had come to live among the 12 tribes, a people who were to be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, as in Exodus chapter 19, verse 6. In a world filled with unholiness, Israel was taught to distinguish between the holy and the profane, the clean and the unclean. This affected the practical ideas of diet, healthful habits, and sexual behavior, as well as ceremonial matters and separation from other gods. God set high standards for the nation, and as leaders of the people, the priests were subject to even higher standards. Written in chapter 21, verse 7 to 8. The priests were responsible for the overall ministry of the tabernacle, so any disobedience on their part brought swift punishment. The same fire that consumed the burnt offerings and signaled approval of the Aaronic priesthood consumed the rebellious sons of Aaron. Chapter 9, verse 24, where the burnt offerings were consumed by fire, and in chapter 10, verses 1 to 2, where the sons of Aaron were consumed also by fire because of the mistake they had done. Severe as it was, the death of Nadab and Abihu demonstrated to all the people the requirements of their holy God. Privilege and position did not give them the luxury of violating the Lord's command. And the second purpose and scope is the greatest commandment, which is love your neighbor. In the midst of a book filled with ritual and ceremony stands a verse cited by Christ as the second greatest commandment, which is love your neighbor as yourself. This was quoted by Christ himself in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, and it was recorded by Matthew chapter 22, verse 39, and Mark chapter 12, verse 31. Quoted more often than any other verse in the Old Testament, Paul indicates that the entire law is summed up in this single command. In Galatians chapter 5, verse 14, also in Romans chapter 13, verse 9. If the people love the Lord with all their hearts and their neighbors as themselves, they will be well along the way to holy living. Neighbor includes the alien who lives with you in your land. And by alien, it means those who are foreigners living in our land. Since Israelites remembered what it was like to be aliens in Egypt, they must not mistreat such individuals. Third purpose and scope: sacrifices and offerings in chapters 1 to 7. To enable the people to be cleansed of their sin and to express their dedication to God, the Lord provides for them a series of sacrifices and offerings in chapters 1 to 7. With Aaron and his sons officiating, these sacrifices were presented before the Lord, the one whose law had been violated, but who was willing to forgive. Atonement was made for those who confessed their sins and offered an animal to die as a substitute for the sinner. Number 4, uncleanness and purification in chapters 11 to 16. It deals with the topic of uncleanness and defilement in relation to food, skin diseases, and bodily discharge. Although uncleanness was not the same as sinfulness, it typified sin and impurity. Anyone affected by skin disease or a bodily discharge had to be cleansed through special ceremonies. The most important cleansing ritual of all, however, which involved the high priest on the Day of Atonement, brought about the forgiveness of Israel's sin. On this one day of the year, the priest sprinkled blood on the atonement cover in the most holy place because of the sin of the people. As a sign that God had removed Israel's sin, a scapegoat symbolically carried away the sin of the nation into the desert. Number 5, the Holiness Code in chapter 17 to 27. Now Israel has learned about the sacrifices and offerings that can atone for sin. In 17 to 27 chapters of Leviticus, it discussed the practical dimensions of holy living, often referred to as the Holiness Code. These chapters cover a variety of topics applicable both to the people and to the priests. In several instances, the laws were designed to help Israel avoid unholy customs of its pagan neighbors, who had defiled the land by their immoral practices. In chapter 27, prohibits the eating of blood or sacrificing to goat idols. And then in chapter 18, it spells out illicit sexual relations, particularly those involving incest. In chapter 19, there is a restatement of several of the Ten Commandments and the appropriate expansion for more precise application. If God's commands or laws are violated, the penalties to be assessed are given in chapter 20. We can read chapter 20 to know these things. Since the priests were set apart to God in a special way, chapters 21 to 22 present rules they and their families had to obey meticulously. And in chapter 23 contains a summary of the religious calendar for the entire year, reviewing the exact time of each festival and what was expected of the people. This expanded in chapter 25 to include a discussion of the sabbatical year, which is every 7th year, and the year of Jubilee, which is every 50 years, both of which had important economic as well as religious implications. If the people obeyed God's laws and commands faithfully, He promised to send them peace and prosperity to walk among them. But if Israel turned their backs on God and disobeyed His law, the nation would suffer imaginable calamity and eventually be driven out of the promised land, as stated chapter 26, verse 14 to 46. Lastly, the special vows, an appendix. Chapter 27 is something of an appendix and deals with special vows made to the Lord. These gifts of persons or property were voluntary once given to God as expression of thanksgiving. Perhaps they are included at the end of Leviticus to keep them separate from the required sacrifices and offerings described in the opening statements. And to include in my report is the authorship and date. According to Bolak, Longman III, and Dillard, and Routledge, they all agree that it was Moses who wrote Leviticus. While the dates, both Bolak, Longman, and Dillard wrote that it was about in 15th to 13th century BC. That ends my report. I may now give it back to the next reporter. Thank you.